Hello, and welcome to Basics for Gamers presents The Basics of Damage Part 1 for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In this video, we will discuss the 4-step process for calculating and applying damage, and in Part 2, we'll expand on that discussion by covering some of the more interesting twists, such as precision damage and persistent damage. During an adventure, players are likely to find themselves in conflict with all manner of dangerous enemies, and if they're like my players, this conflict will probably result in someone getting stabbed. And when that happens, damage is inflicted. As you are probably already aware, every creature has a number of hit points, and when that total falls to 0, really bad things happen. A future video titled The Basics of Life and Death will cover how that works, but for this conversation, what's important to understand is damage is the mechanism by which hit points are reduced. And there's more going on there than just simple subtraction. There is a 4-step process for resolving damage. Step 1 is determine the base damage. Any effect that applies damage should include a number of dice to roll to determine the base damage. In rare cases, the effect will provide a flat number without the need to roll dice, but generally speaking, you will make a damage roll. Step 2 is determine the damage type. We'll talk about this more in a bit, but there's no such thing as generic damage in Pathfinder. All damage has at least one type. For example, slashing damage or fire damage. This is important to know when you're dealing with Step 3. Which is adjust the base damage for any immunities, resistances, or vulnerabilities the target might have. And in Step 4, you apply the damage. Whatever total is remaining at the end of Step 3 is subtracted from the target's current hit points. In the first step, we calculate the base damage of the effect, and the best place to start that discussion is with weapon damage. Damage from weapon attacks is pretty straightforward. If it's a melee attack like swinging an axe, then base damage is equal to the weapon's damage dice plus the attacker's strength modifier. And if it's a ranged attack, it's just the weapon's damage dice. You do not add any ability modifier to the damage for a ranged attack. For example, you do not add dexterity to a ranged attack as is done in some other games. And there are a few ways to adjust this damage even further. Weapons with the thrown trait, like javelins, add your strength modifier to their damage even though they're ranged attacks. But there is one notable exception to this. Weapons with the splash trait, like acid flasks or bombs, do not have any strength modifiers added to them, even though they may be thrown. If the weapon has the propulsive trait, like slings and composite bows, you add half your strength modifier to the damage, or all of your strength modifier if that is a negative number. And if the weapon has the two-hand trait, the damage dice increases to the listed value. For example, bastard swords have a base damage of 1d8, but when they're wielded with both hands, that increases to 1d12. And this is a change to its base damage die, so any effect that further modifies its dice are based off of d12s. For example, a bastard sword with a striking rune deals 2d12 damage when wielded with both hands. So in the first step, we begin with a damage roll for the effect, but it's important to note that in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, there are only 3 instances that are defined as quote damage rolls, and they are the damage dice for a weapon, unarmed attacks, and for spell attacks. I sometimes refer to this as the base damage to distinguish it from anything that's added on. For example, suppose you have a flaming warhammer. If you hit a monster with it, you might roll 1 die for the weapon damage and roll another die for the extra fire damage. But technically speaking, the only quote damage roll would be for the weapon. And the reason this is important is for times when you see abilities like Inspire Courage that grant a bonus to, quote, damage rolls. This only applies to the weapon damage dice, unarmed damage dice, and spell damage dice, and not to any other effect that's tagged onto that base damage. So, Inspire Courage would add +1 to the damage of the Flaming Warhammer, not +2. There will be times when you need to double the damage or cut it in half. For example, when you roll a critical hit, the damage is doubled. This is pretty simple. You just roll the damage as normal, with all the usual bonuses such as a strength bonus for a melee attack, and then you multiply that total by 2. And then any extra damage that only applies to critical hits is added on top of that. For example, weapons with the deadly trait inflict additional bonus damage on critical hits. So, say you have a strength modifier of +2 and score a critical hit with a Rapier. Rapiers deal 1d6 damage and have the deadly d8 trait. On a critical hit, you would roll the normal damage of 1d6 +2, and then double that total, and then add the extra 1d8 for the deadly trait. The key to remember is you never double damage that only occurs on critical hits, so you wouldn't double the 1d8 from the deadly trait because it only applies to critical hits in the first place. Next, let's consider a rogue using their dagger to sneak attack someone. Again, we'll say they have a +2 strength modifier and their sneak attack deals 1d6 damage. If this rogue scores a critical hit with a sneak attack, the damage would be the dagger's usual 1d4 +2 plus 1d6 for the sneak attack, and then that entire total is doubled. Because sneak attack damage is not dependent on there being a critical hit, it does get doubled. And there will be times when you need to cut the damage in half, such as when the target of a spell succeeds on their reflex save. In these cases, you simply divide the damage by 2 and round down. Remember, the rule of thumb for Pathfinder is that you always round down unless you are specifically told to do otherwise. Damage in Pathfinder is not generic, and each source of damage should list its damage type. There are many different damage types, and we'll be covering the more common and straightforward of those in this video, and the remaining damage types will be discussed in part 2. First, there are 3 kinds of physical damage, which are bludgeoning, like being hit with a club or hammer, piercing, like being shot with an arrow or stabbed by a spear, and slashing, like being cut by an axe. The damage listing for weapons show a letter B, P, or S next to the damage dice to represent the damage type. So when you strike a skeleton with a warhammer, you don't deal 6 points of damage, rather you deal 6 points of bludgeoning damage. Energy damage works much the same way, with acid, cold, electricity, fire, force, and sonic damage. So if that warhammer I was just mentioning was a flaming warhammer, it might deal 6 points of bludgeoning damage and 4 points of fire damage. It's important to keep those separate rather than simply saying you hit the skeleton for 10 points of damage. And you'll see why it's important to keep those 2 damage pools separate when we get into step 3. The material a weapon is made out of is also important to note. For example, weapons made from adamantine, cold iron, or silver. Because of this, some weapons will have more than one trait assigned to a single damage effect. So let's consider that warhammer and the skeleton again. If it was a flaming silver warhammer and it struck a skeleton, we would note that it did 6 points of bludgeoning damage that also has the silver trait, and in addition to that, also inflicted 4 points of fire damage. When a weapon is made of a special material, like silver or cold iron, that trait is applied to the weapon's base damage type. So it's silver and bludgeoning for 6 points of damage, but the fire damage is merely fire damage, and not silver fire damage. Those are the most common damage types that we will be using in this discussion about the 4-step process for managing damage, but there are a few more, including alignment damage, positive damage, negative damage, and precision damage, That all will be covered in part 2. Once you determine the type of damage being inflicted, you can then check for any special resistances or weaknesses the target might have. And it's important to note that these conditions are applied in a very specific order. First, you apply any immunities, then you apply any weaknesses, and last you apply resistances. So first, immunities. When a creature is immune to a damage type, damage of that type is completely ignored, but only that specific type. So if a creature that is immune to fire is hit by a flaming silver warhammer that deals 6 points of silver bludgeoning damage and 4 points of fire damage, they'll ignore all of the fire damage but still suffer the 6 points of silver bludgeoning. Some creatures like oozes might be immune to critical hits, and I think that is poorly named. It might be better to think of it as immunity to critical damage, because when a creature that is listed as being immune to critical hits is struck by a critical hit, it does normal damage instead of double damage, and that's the only change. If the critical hit includes other effects like a grapple, then that target is still grappled. So the critical hit occurs, but not the critical damage. That's how it works by Raw. However, many argue that any damaging effects caused by a critical hit should also be ignored if the hit is immune to critical hits. For example, the extra weapon damage dice that are granted with weapons that have the deadly trait. After all, if the ooze is immune to critical hits because it doesn't have any vital organs, then is there any reason why a weapon with a deadly trait would be more effective against it? Bottom line, rules as written states that the only change is you do not double the damage and everything else triggered by the critical hit still occurs. But as always, GMs can and should run the combat however makes the most sense. After immunities, you apply weaknesses. Weaknesses will include a value in their listing such as Fire 5. Whenever such a creature suffers fire damage, you simply add 5 points to it. So say you strike a monster that has a weakness of Fire 5 with our Flaming Silver Warhammer and roll 6 points of silver bludgeoning damage and 4 points of fire damage, that would increase the fire damage by 5, making it 9 points of fire damage for a total of 15. When a creature has a weakness to more than one trait of a single damage effect, they only suffer the single highest weakness value, and this can be a little tricky. So if a creature has 2 weaknesses, say they have the weakness Silver 10 and the weakness Bludgeoning 5, and you hit it with a Flaming Silver Warhammer that deals 6 points of silver bludgeoning damage and 4 points of fire damage, then that creature will suffer 16 points of silver bludgeoning damage, not 21, and 4 points of fire damage for a total of 20. Because when more than one trait applies to the same damage effect, in this case, both silver and bludgeoning apply to the 6 points of weapon damage, then you only apply the highest weakness. And neither of those traits apply to the fire damage effect, so it is not changed by the weaknesses, even though fire was caused by a weapon that has those traits for its physical damage type. But if a creature has the weaknesses Fire 5 and Silver 10 and is struck by our hammer, it will suffer both of those weaknesses because they are separate damage rolls and separate damage effects, even though they're from the same attack. The key to remember here is that this almost never occurs except when a creature is vulnerable to both a type of physical damage, like bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing, and also weak to the material the weapon is made of, like adamantine, cold iron, or silver. Because then it's 1 damage roll, but 2 traits that trigger 2 weaknesses. And last, after applying immunities and weaknesses, you then apply resistances. This works much the same way as weaknesses, except you subtract the value listed from the damage instead of adding it. So if you attack a creature that has resistance to bludgeoning 10 and deal 6 points of bludgeoning and 4 points of fire damage with your trusty flaming warhammer, they will suffer 0 bludgeoning damage, but would still take the 4 points of fire damage. This is why we keep those damage pools separate and not add them together until step 4. And one more type of resistance that's worth mentioning is resistance to non-magical attacks. In a case like that, you apply the resistance to normal weapon attacks, but not to magical weapon attacks. So say you're fighting a creature that has resistance 5 to non-magical weapons. If you hit it with a normal hammer and roll 6 points of damage, that will be reduced to only 1. But if you hit it with a +1 warhammer, it has the magical trait, and therefore none of its damage is reduced by resistance to non-magical attacks. So, just to bring this all together, remember that damage is applied in 4 steps. Step 1 is calculate the damage. You roll the damage dice and add all the usual modifiers to it. Step 2, determine the type of damage. At this step, you're mostly just making note of the different traits of the attack for use in the next step, which is step 3, where you apply immunities, and then you apply weaknesses, and last, you apply resistances. And last, in step 4, you reduce the target's hit points by whatever amount of damage remains after step 3. This would also be when you would apply the hardness of an object or shield. The value of the hardness is deducted from the final total of damage and not individually for each different type. It's important to understand these steps so that you can answer questions like, if I critically hit a monster that has a weakness to fire with my flaming warhammer, do I double the extra damage from that weakness? And the answer is no, you don't. Even though a critical hit doubles all the damage that is not dependent on there being a critical hit, that doubling occurs in step 1. And you don't adjust for a weakness or a resistance until step 3. So no, that extra damage from the weakness is not doubled because that doubling happens in step 1, which is before the weakness being applied in step 3. And that's the basic foundation for how damage works in Pathfinder. Once again, if you would like to learn about some of the more interesting twists to the system, make sure you check out Damage Part 2, and that video covers persistent damage, precision damage, alignment damage, non-lethal damage, positive damage, and negative damage. Before we close, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our patrons. These videos would not be possible without their continued generosity and support. Members of the Basics for Gamers Patreon community receive special benefits, like getting to vote on the topics that we cover in the future, and also they get to see these videos 1 week and ad-free before everybody else. Visit the link shown on the left of the screen and in the description if you'd like to know more about becoming a patron. If you would like to support this channel and help it grow, the easiest way to do that is by subscribing and clicking the bell icon so you get notified when new videos release. And we can always be reached through our Twitter and Facebook pages too. Thanks for watching, take care, and we will see you soon with more Basics of Pathfinder.